Hello, I think we've got everybody up there. I'm going to be doing an acrylic demonstration today. I've got two cameras, so excuse me if I flip looking between the two, but it's not going to be about me, it's going to be about what's going on here. So this is just saying hello, really. This is the reference that I'm going to be using. It's from a photograph that I took when I was out in Canada last year, so I hope you're watching, Val. This is from one of our days out painting. So I'm going to get going. This is with acrylic. Of course there's something I've left behind, which is a water pot, so I'm just going to put some water in. Okay, ever the way with technology, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to get started. Now I know some of you have used acrylics a lot before, some of you have hardly ever used them. So I'm just going to go through my way of starting a painting and building up the layers. I'm going to be using mostly Atelier interactive acrylics, which I love using. I've got a couple of brushes. I'm going to start off with this one, and this one I'm going to use for a lot of the painting. It's a Da Vinci brush, a couple of other smaller brushes. So bear with me whilst I turn all the cameras around, and then I shall get painting. And then I can get going. Now with the reference picture that I've got here, I don't tend to do a huge amount of drawing, so I'm just going to get a mixture, a neutral colour really, so I'm going to use a mixture of blue and brown, ultramarine and umber, and I'm just going to mark out where things are going to go on my picture. So I've got the areas down here, that area across there, and the waterfall coming in there. So it's just doing a little bit of positioning to start off with. Then I'm going to take some dark, again the same blue-brown mix, and I'm just, oh, I picked up a bit of green as well. Just going to start off by blocking in my darks and my lights. Now this is so very different from painting with watercolours, because with watercolours you start from light to dark, and with acrylics you start from dark to light, generally speaking. This area of trees up here. I've covered over this area of the waterfall because I shall put that back in afterwards. I've left this main area here, so I'm going to take some of my ultramarine. I'm going to use burnt umber this time, just to give me a slightly different, a warmer mix. Start putting some grey in here at the top of the waterfall. This is still just blocking everything in at this stage. And again, I'm going to put some of this grey colour down at the bottom here. And then I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine to it. And so make this sort of very blue-grey coming down on the waterfall itself. Like I say, I'll add that one in later. So within a couple of minutes I've got the whole picture covered. As I say, you're going from dark to light, so it's definitely darker than the end picture is going to be. So moving a couple of things here. So now I just need to give that a second just to dry off a little bit. So now I'm going to come back in, patches of it. Now the thing with the Atelier interactive acrylic is that it generally dries slower than standard acrylic, but the thinness of the layer I've put on here, I've put this on really watered down, so it's touch dry quite quickly. But if I wanted to, I could spray it and just with a little bit of water, and then that reactivates the paint, and that's the beauty of the interactive acrylics. So I'm going to come back up and just sort of work my way from the back forwards a little bit here. Okay, so again, coming back into my blue-grey, again still using the same brush, I'm just going to bring this in here. Now I'm putting on a slightly thicker layer of paint. Using this big brush I can cover the ground very, very rapidly. And as I come forward, I'm just adding a little bit more of that burnt sienna in there. There's some warmer, browner colours coming into my picture as I come forward. But I also need some light going on in there. So I'm putting a little bit of my titanium white in there as well. I'll come back and put texture into this on another layer. So it's a little bit more of the brown. Just as it starts to fall over the edge of the fall, there's some darker colours in there as well, even darker than I'm doing here, but I'll be coming back in and doing some detail. I just want to get coverage really to start off with. So that's a thicker layer, so that's working to give me a bit more coverage on there. I'm going to come up here, there's an island with some trees on the background there. So I'm using a little bit of my shadow green, again with my burnt umber, or you could use burnt sienna, they're similar. Just starting to put some more dark up here. It's quite bold, and that's fine. We'll add the light to it later. Just picking up a little bit of a chrome green as well, just touches of that in there. Okay, so just getting a little bit more of my dark just along that edge there. And because there is a little bit of a reflection, I'm putting a bit more of the warm brown in there. I'm just going to drag some of that down. And then we put some ripples over the top of that later. Hopefully that will give me that sort of reflective look. Again, I've just cleaned my brush. I've washed it, I've dried it, and then just dragging that through. Need a little more water on there. We'll come back up into that area there in a little while. So I want to come down here into my rocks. So I'm using my burnt umber or raw sienna with some ultramarine. And again, I'm going in for the darker areas first. A little more paint, a little less water. Just having a look at where all this comes across. Putting all this dark in. Then picking up a little bit of lighter colour. So what I've got here is a bit of the burnt sienna, and I've put a touch of Naples yellow into that, just to give me this lighter patch on the rocks, on the top of the rocks. And I'm going to pick up a bit of white. I haven't cleaned my brush, so I've got the same colour still on my brush, and I'm picking up a little bit of white. And there's some interesting patches of rock here, so I'm just going to start suggesting at some of those. So it's just beginning to build these shapes, so I'll let that settle a little bit. And then come back and do similar on this side over here, so I'm using my blues and my browns. Creating the darks that I need first. Oh, hello. Hi Jacqueline. Yes, I'm sorry I didn't get to lemon them just yet. I will get there. I will get there. Okay, so putting these darks through, and then coming back to that lighter colour that I had there. And we've got the shape of the lighter parts of these rocks coming forward. Need a little bit more of that. And then these ones have a very light top to them, so I'm going to put some of that and there we are. So blocking that in. Okay, just going to put a little bit of marking up here just so I can see the edges of this. And for this I'm using a colour called Muck off the palette, my favourite colour of all, so it's a little bit of what I've got left on my palette. Okay, so I've put a second layer on everything except here, so I need to just build up the texture of the paint. So I'm going to come in with the grey first, and the grey was my ultramarine, umber and my titanium white. So I'm going to start off, let's have a bit more of that in there, down here, building the texture of the water that's down here. And there's quite a greeny patch. This is Canada and you get a lot of that glacial water here, so we need a little bit of a sort of turquoisey green just coming in at the edges here. A lot of this is going to be covered by the foam, but it's just quite nice to have little flashes of that showing through. So there we go. And then come back to my tumbling fall. Add a bit more of the blue to it and a little bit more of the white, but I still want this to be a shadow colour at the moment. I'll add my brightness to it in a bit. So I'm going from my dark to my light, and there are some really quite dark patches in the water down here. There's lots of water tumbling in all sorts of different directions, so I'm just getting this all marked up. Putting in a little bit of that turquoisey colour. I added some of my chrome green and a little bit of the phthalo turquoise to give me that greeny colour. So I'm using this brush in lots of different directions. I'm picking up some of my ultramarine, my umber into this, because there are some quite dark patches in amongst the foam coming through here, so I need those to be visible through. So let's just bring some of those down. So bringing those darker colours that are just going to peek through. And let's start shaping. I've got, let's come back up here, we've got this section of the water to come down, so I'm just going to start working on the rocks around there. So again, behind where that goes, there's some darker patches just behind that fall of water. And I'm not worried about detail as yet. Still using my 30mm brush, so my 1-inch brush effectively. A bit more colour in there. chrome green because we've got some shrubbery coming up in a couple of areas there, just so I know where they are. There we go. So, just give my brush a bit of a clean. So far the whole thing has been done with this brush, and this is a very old one. I've had this one a very long time. They last really well. So, but now I need to go on to some more detail. So I'm coming down to a smaller brush. So I'm going to use, it could just be a flat brush. I've got a De La Rowney System 3. This is a filbert, so that's got the oval head to it. So, but you could equally use something. Let's put that over there so you can see it just a little flat. So up to you. So I've got my shadow green again that I'm going to add some brown into. I just want, this is a little bit scratchy up here, so I just want to start by putting a bit more, again it's just building those layers of paint. And if anybody's wondering, I'm working on SAA practice acrylic paper, which I love working on. I know it's supposed to be practice paper, but I love it. It's got a bit of a texture on it, a bit of a canvas texture on it, and I like painting on it, so I use it quite frequently. So I'm just going to use some of this chrome green dropped in now. There we go. Don't want to put too much detail in here. It's in the background. I want it to stay in the background. So I'm picking up with that same colour, the green, the dark green, shadow green that I'm using. I'm putting a little bit of my burnt umber or raw sienna in there. I'm just going to put a few dark ripples coming across from the edge here. Dragging those out across a little bit. Now there's an area here on my photograph where there's like a little ridge as it comes to the edge of the waterfall. And then in amongst this there is some darker bits underneath the edge of that fall as it just goes over that precipice there. So when I put the light on there of that water, that should work quite nicely. So we're starting to build that drop. Now I'm going to go back to my big brush for a minute. I'm just going to pick up some titanium white and add it into the remaining of the grey that's on my palette. So just to show you as I go through on the palette, I'm mixing these colours and just gradually changing them. So this is the palette that I'm using. And it's a palette that comes with a lid that you can put the paint in and the water pot, and it's called a deluxe brush bath, which I think is wonderful. But it works, and it means I can close the lid off and keep my paint from being too exposed to the air. So I'm just using the flat side of this brush just to give me some ripples in the water at the top here. Just gradually. I'm getting carried away here, I'm enjoying myself too much. Hi Dawn, how are you? So, just creating some of those ripples. And this is something you can spend a lot more time. I'm doing this as a demo, so I'm doing this quite rapidly. I would spend normally a little bit more time on this, but I'm sure you don't want to see me do every last brush stroke. You'd be here for ages. Right, coming back down now, I'm going to use this brush next, which is number 8 round. This is a Pebeo brush as it happens, but I do also really like the SAA silver brushes. I think they work really well as well. So now I'm just going to start breaking this edge where I've got this water just coming over that edge. It's not my bright white yet, it's still a little bit diluted. Hi Ali, how are you? Bringing this through, so this is kind of following the direction of the water. So it gives you that sort of sense of that water sort of caving in there. And I actually want my darks there just to be a little darker in places too, so I'm just going to pop back in and make some little darker marks too. There we go. Okay, I think I need to come back in and work on my rocks for a little bit now. So I'm going to use, probably go back to my filbert actually, this brush here that I was using. Okay. See, that's what happens when you work from home. I've just dropped one of my slippers off my foot. I'm working in my slippers. Right, so now I'm coming in and just putting some more dark textures in the background for my rocks. So it's just breaking these shapes up ever so slightly. And you can use the end of your brush just to scratch into it as well. And again, you're working dark to light, so this is still very dark. I'm going to put all my highlights onto here in a little bit. This breaks up here, this rock, just to make a different shape. There's a few bits of broken rock. Oh, what have we got there, Laurie? First time watching acrylics. Well, I hope you're enjoying it. It's a very different process than if you're used to working with watercolours. I work in both, and I love flipping. Some days you're in the mood for one, and some days you're in the mood for something else. So it's really nice having something completely different. Val, hi. Almost like I was right there with you. I remember sitting there. I was looking through the photographs of us sitting there painting this view in Canada last summer. Oh, if only we could travel again, eh? We'll get there. I think when we sat there, Val, I did this in watercolour, if that's right. So, just still building the darks. It's one of those things, if you're used to working with watercolour and you're used to working light to dark, this building all of the darks before you get going is quite, it feels quite unusual, feels quite unnatural. But just bear with. Putting these shadows in. There's quite a lot of foliage in here, so just a bit of scratching. And then here it's like a shale at the top here, so I almost need to just kind of have little slices of colour coming through. And again, when I put a few highlights into that, that should look like some slices of colour. Okay, now here there were some other strange shapes. And you can put colour in, push it around, and make all these wonderful marks. There's a lot of water going to run down over this in a minute, so it's just about preparing that background. And this is the thing with acrylics, it's about preparing what you want to see through and around and in between other things. So we have, okay, so again, now we've got those darks in on those rocks, I'm just going to reiterate some of those lights. So I'm putting my burnt umber with a little bit of my Naples yellow, and I'm going to use a bit with this filbert, and then I'm going to go to a slightly smaller brush. I'm doing a bit of dragging here. I don't actually want to cover the whole thing. It's about creating like dry marks and dry textures. Little highlights. And down here there's some, let's say, some interesting patches of rock. And whilst I've got these colours here, I shall just bring them across to the other side. It's about trying to create that sort of unity and harmony within the painting, so keeping the colours moving from one side to the other. And this is something that I didn't start out like this. When I first started, I used to start in one corner of the painting and work my way across, and I'm sure some of you will recognise that way of working. But unfortunately, it doesn't always create a harmony, particularly if you're painting over several sessions. So what happens is you don't get the same colour, you're not in the same mood, so you're not making the same gestural marks and just little shapes that you do, and it becomes a little disjointed. So this is why I jump around all over the place, trying to use the same colours on one side as the other. Quite like the way that little bit in the middle there is coming out. Right, now I'm going to pick up a bit more white with this. I just want, it's not going white, it's just using the colour I've just been using with a little bit lighter, and I'm just creating a couple of little highlights. Actually, I'm going to do this with a smaller brush, so I'm going to go over to my number 8 round for this. I'm using the side of the brush, so I'm kind of doing a bit like you would in watercolour with a bit of dry brushing, and then I've got just my finger that I'm smudging with in places. Again, this is just about creating some different textures and marks. And as I go on, my marks get smaller, so that I'm creating, I start off with the big shapes and then I'm working my way down to the smaller ones. Okay, then on the top here, this is the perfect colour. Doing some of these areas here, it's just where the rocks just at the top. There we go. Please feel free, if any of you has got any questions, please just shout. I'll do my best to keep an eye on what's coming in. If I miss you, I will answer you afterwards. Okay, so we've got this sort of shaly area here. Now, one of the things I find, particularly if you're going from watercolours into working with acrylics, that people kind of stumble over, is the amount of water in your brush and the amount of water on your palette. If you have a look, my paint there is not running around. It's just sat in the palette, and it's thicker than you're used to with watercolours. But with that, you need to control the amount of water you have in your brush. So it's very much a case of taking your cloth and your brush, and when you've washed it, dry it, and then you choose how much water you've got rather than putting too much down. Okay, right. I think we need to start putting some of the light down here in the waterfall so you can see how it looks. So I'm taking my titanium white and I'm mixing it with a bit of this blue grey that I had left on my palette. We'll build to the whitest whites. So I don't want this neat. This isn't that type of water. It's not like a smooth area like up here. We need this to kind of bowl and tumble. Now this colour that I've put down here to start off with is what I would call my shadow colour. So I don't want to cover over all of it. I want that to still be visible. Don't want to lose that. We've got an area. So I'm just taking a separate brush, and I'm just with a damp brush, I'm just moving some of that around because I want it scruffy. So where I put this dark in here, I'm trying to make sure I have some of that still visible through. Again, so I'm just taking my damp brush, just moving some of that around, and then you've got that dark just showing through. Okay. This is kind of quite a tight area in the middle of the waterfall. It is quite bright in my reference photograph, but I want to leave some of that shadow colour showing through. And then we have all of this froth and stuff at the bottom. And I'm just going to move some of that around. Scrubby brush here. Just to push some of this out of the way. Now this is an old brush that I'm going to use in a minute to do some splattering. It started out life as a filbert, but it's been so worn down by the way I paint that it's now this little stump, so it's perfect for some little scruffy jobs. So we're starting to get this water coming down. I'm going to add some more brightness to that in a few minutes. So I'm going to let that dry back a little bit, and then I can come back and put another layer onto that. Okay, so we've got the fall coming down here, so we need a little bit of what's happening up here. It kind of tips over this edge here. Okay. So again, this is a bit sort of dry brushing like you might do with watercolour. So I'm trying not to hit every part of the canvas. I'm just letting this collect parts of it as we come down. Now where this big rock is, it seems to kind of spread out a little bit, this fall. It's like it gets caught on that big rock. And again, there's a busier part in the centre. And then it just gets wider as it comes down, as it keeps catching on these different layers of rocks. And then reaches down into the water down here. Again, that's all a bit scrappy at the minute, so just going to come back in. There's always these little sort of splash parts coming off at the sides. And something I haven't got much of on this side is my shadow blue, so I'm just going to take some ultramarine in with my white. Just make some of that a bit more shadowed before I put my brights on top. Dab a few more of them back into here. You don't realise how important the shadows are until you actually start really putting those brights on top. Just about making this. Right, I'm coming back in now with slightly brighter white. I'm going to come down here and just add some brighter parts. Just dragging that through, so leaving little streaks. Start bringing it down a little bit here, and then I'll come back into the middle. Just do little rows of dots, because you often get those little rows of dots, which is just the spray coming down. Just mess that up a little bit. I don't like things being too neat. It's not in my nature. Okay. So we're almost done with this. So we've got that layer coming down there, so we now need to put some brights into the centre. Again, this is where the shadows start to play their part, because this shows up. If you don't put the shadows down first, this layer doesn't show up as anywhere near as much as you want it to. And one of the things with acrylics, I sometimes find that when you put the white on, particularly if you're painting all in one go like this, because the underneath paint hasn't fully dried, I do sometimes find that the white sinks in a little bit and you have to go over it to make it bright enough. So if that happens to you, don't worry, that's normal. So I'm putting lots of little dots and marks down and then I'm using my finger just to move some of those around. It makes a more random mark, that's why I quite like it. Drag up the top there. A few little highlights on the top. Hopefully you can see this is now beginning to get a little bit of that brightness going on in the waterfall. So I just washed my brush there, and I'm just using the stamp brush again just to move things around a little bit to make random. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my big brush because I want to put some of the froth and the foam that's going on down here. I just need to dry that bit. Okay, so I'm dragging this, again it's just a little bit of a sideways scribble, and I can refine this with my smaller brushes in a minute, but it's just quite a nice way of getting a whole load of this mark making down rapidly. Starts it all off. Bit of froth and foam. I do like the marks that this brush makes. It is nice to work with. I do find that a lot of the times I'm painting, I realise I've done 90% of the painting with the one brush. Whites, and I'm just going to refine a little bit of what I've got down here. So again, it's a whole load of scribbling with the brush. Kind of defining the edge here with a bit of that rock colour showing through underneath the water. And so this is where a lot of that greeny colour will disappear, but it's just enough showing through to give you that sort of hint of it. A bit more scribbling. So when you say, how did she paint that picture? She was scruffy and she did a lot of scribbling, and that would be about right. Oh, Laurie, thank you. It's fascinating. Now the thing with this Atelier Interactive acrylic is that you can re-wet it. So now I'm just going to wet some of this and take some of it back out again. Hopefully showing through some of that underneath colour because I'm doing it gently. I've just got a little bit to do over here in a minute with the bit of that foliage, and I've got to do a bit of splattering, and then I'm nearly done. There's a few places here that this drags down. It's kind of comes through in different places. And then there's some coming up here as well. Couple more of these. Again, just these little fine drag marks. That's probably enough there. Right, so I need to come back to my little stumpy brush here, and I'm going to pick up my white, bluey white and white. If you think of the paint coming out of the tube as softened butter, you need single cream. So I need to dilute it a little bit to make it splatter. If it's too thick, it won't work. So I'm just going to use this to do a little bit of splattering. So I'm just dragging my finger across the top of the brush to create a little bit of splatter. It's a very fine mist. It's quite difficult to control where this goes, but you can a bit. You do get used to it, and you can control it a little bit. On this one as well. Oh, that's a nice little splash that's gone up there. Okay, so I'm just keep picking up more paints with a little bit of water in there. I'm going to bring that around. Then I'm going to do this bit afterwards, and I wanted to do this bit last because the splatter is going to be behind this section of rocks, so I wanted to make sure I get my splatter on before I do that section of the foliage. This gives you that lovely sort of misty. Now the one thing painting can't do is give you the sound of this. I wish you could add sound to paintings, because the roar of these waterfalls is just stunning. So you can see, if I want my spray to go that way, I have my brush there and I get my spray going up that side. If I want it to go that way, I turn my brush that way to get my spray there. But that's about as much control as you have. There we go, just these little bits there. And then I'm going to come back to my filbert and put my mixture of shadow green and the burnt umber. There are some plants and things that are growing in amongst all of this. And I just want to get some of that in there. And then I'm going to pick up my chrome green. I haven't cleaned my brush, I'm just picking up the chrome green, and that starts to lighten the colour. And then a bit more. And perhaps a little bit of my Naples yellow. Don't want too much information on here, but it's just kind of a foreground frame for what's going on in the background. I'm getting a right old mess when I do my paintings. So I think at the minute what I would say is I would probably spend a bit of time, and I probably will after I've come off the live, just fiddling and just tidying up a few, putting in a few extra highlights and darks and shapes, but not a lot. So I'll have a fiddle and I'll post the finished picture there, but of course you have to do this bit because this bit is the big fun part of it. It always looks better when you take the tape off. There we go. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to paint the waterfall with acrylics. Really what I wanted to get across was the process of building up the acrylics, the idea of starting with the darks, building up to the lights, working big, working so that you make your shapes big first and then break them down to smaller shapes. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to turn you all around so I can say goodbye to you. There we go, that's one. And that's the other one. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining me. Any questions afterwards, please just shout. And I will see you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.